Hey, how's it going everyone? In this lesson, we'll see the use of var, let, and const to create variables in JavaScript, and what is their behavior according to how they've been created and where we have placed them in our code. First, we'll see a comparison table and some examples in the console to see the differences between them. And in the second part of this lecture, I'll show you how these variables behave inside their scopes. So, let's get started. In JavaScript, we have three main ways to create variables in order to store data in memory, so it can be used by the program whenever needed. And it is by using these three keywords, provided by the language since ES6, when let and const were included, as before that, only var was available. And even though now it is not recommended to use it anymore, you'll see why in a minute, but it is important to differentiate the use of each of these options anyways, since they have their own characteristics, and as I said, a different behavior depending on how and where they have been created, what is their scope, and how they are used, so they might not give us the results as we expect. If we take a look at this table, these are the concepts that are important to differentiate. We'll talk about declaration, redeclaration of variables, reassignment, and so on. Now, let's comment them out one by one in the code with some examples. Using var and let, we can simply declare a variable, which is equivalent to creating a space in memory and assigning a value to it as well. This name is called identifier, and it will work as a reference to access the values that we have assigned to this space when necessary. So something like this. If we create two variables, one with var and the other one with let, and we console log them, we can see how both are undefined. That's because with var and let, it is allowed to just declare them, and these variables will be just a space with a name so far, but with no values inside of it, so they're undefined by default, as the memory space is already established. On the other hand, if we want to do the same thing with const and just declare a variable, it'll give us an error, as it is mandatory to assign a value to it from the very beginning. So we must initialize the variable with some value. Right? So to initialize a variable, we'll use the name of the reference together with the assignment operator and some value, of course. Now, if we console log them all, we can see how brown is the only one that's been defined so far. Now in the case of var and let, as they are already declared, we can initialize them with some value using the name of the reference and the assignment operator. Now, if we console log them all, we can see the values in the console. Right? The thing is that if we want to update the values that we have included inside the variables, in the case of var and let, we can reassign the value whenever we want. Well, that's one of the points of being a variable. But in the case of const, it is a bit tricky, because const stands for constant. And we must keep in mind that it is not completely constant, let's say. In fact, what must be constant is the reference to this variable, but only at a reference level, because when using the const keyword, the JavaScript engine expects a constant and unique value that is lexically linked to that variable, and therefore cannot be reassigned or redeclared as such. But if an object or an array have been assigned to a const variable, then the properties of the object and the items inside the array that we have defined can be updated, deleted, or added, since they are expandable structures, but the object or array, let's say, that remains the same. Let's see some examples. In the case of var and let, we'll just update the value. Right. Now let's create an object. Now, if we want to change one of these properties, we can do it with no problem. If we console log this object, we can see how color has changed. And the same will happen with an array. Right? If we change one of these items, and now we console log this, we can see how it has changed as well. Now, something else is worth mentioning is that we can redeclare a variable declared with var as many times as we want. So we can do something like this with no problem. But with let, we cannot do that. It gives us an error. And the same with const, of course. Now, something else to consider is that if we use var in the global scope, and we'll talk about scopes in a minute, these values will be stored in the window object of the browser, while with let and const, even if they are in the global scope, they will not. This is something that prevents errors and makes the code much more strict. So if we take a look at the window object, we can see how this variable is inside of it, with the last value, of course. But the variables declared with let and const, they're not there. So if we want to access these variables, which will be the same, we can see how they both undefined, because they're not assigned to the window object. And by the way, now that we're talking about the window object, there's another way to create variables in JavaScript, which is without using any of these three keywords. And what we do actually is to create global variables that are assigned to the window object, but we'll talk about them when we talk about the scopes. I'll just show you what I mean. Right, and we go to the window object again. We can see A and B. We'll talk about this in a minute. Now let's talk about the scopes. Obviously, it is impossible to talk about variables without talking about their scopes. During the execution of the script, it will be necessary to access the values that we have stored in these locations in memory from other areas inside the same code. But the access to these variables is not always the same. And depending on how they are declared and where these variables are written in the code, this access from another point of the code will be possible or not. So it is usually explained as a matter of visibility. That is, if these variables are visible from outside the scope to which they belong, let's say. So the scope can be defined as a set of code that defines the visibility of all the variables inside of it from outside, so from another scope. And it's something very important when it comes to avoiding execution errors. Later, we will see the comparison and the differences, but for example, a variable declared with var inside a conditional will not be the same as a variable declared with let inside the same statement. And this visibility of the values from another point of the code, let's say the ability to be able to access to them or not, is what we call scope. There are 4 types of scopes: block scope, function scope, module scope, and global scope. And to put it simple, in fact, you can think of it as if there were 2 main sizes of scopes, where the block and function scope are the small scopes, while the module and the global scopes are the large ones. Small scopes are much restrictive, or let's say they mean less visibility of the variables than the large ones. But again, it depends on the variables you use. I'll explain them from small to large, because I think it's easier to understand. So, from the most restrictive position to the most visible one. First we have block scope and function scope, or local scope. In fact, in JavaScript and in many other languages, a block is actually a statement, which is a group of 0 or more statements, and it is surrounded or enclosed inside a pair of curly braces. In C and C++, it is also known as a compound statement, or simply a block statement. and includes the list of statements that must be executed. So function scope is just some kind of block scope. If we talk about block scope, any block of code can limit the access to the value of the variables, no matter if it's a conditional, a function, or standalone block. Let's see some examples. See, I've got some files here that I'll be using to explain the following concepts, so it's easier to understand. Now, if we create a simple block of code and we create some variables inside of it, now if we console log them from inside, we can see how they are in the console. But if we want to use these variables from outside, it'll give us an error. Right? That's because let and const make these variables not visible from outside. But in the case of var, it is visible. Right? So we do something like this. You can see how var is visible. Now we do the same thing inside a conditional statement. And we create some variables inside. And if we want to use them from inside, we see 1, 2, 3. But if we want to use them from outside, we'll have the same problem. Y and Z, they're not defined. And that's again because of this block of code that limits the access to the variables declared with let and const. Now let's see what happens if we use a function. I've got some files here again. If we create a function with some variables inside, right, we console log them from inside. We can see the values in the console. But if we want to use them from outside, it'll give us an error. That's because even a, which is declared with var, is blocked by the function, while bar and let, they blocked by the block scope. That is because var is limited to the function scope. So in the case of a variable declared with var, is a function that limits its visibility, not the block scope. As I mentioned before, we can create variables without any keyword, and they'll be assigned to the global object, which is the window object inside the browser. So I'll comment this out. So if we create a global variable, and we take a look at the window object now, we can see how it is assigned to the window object. But as you can see here, this window object has its own properties and methods that make the browser work. So for instance, the method alert. Doing this, we can override this method. Now you can see how the method is not there anymore. So it is not recommended declaring variables this way because it can change the default behavior of the browser if we accidentally overwrite the properties inside the window or global object. In the same way, we can also create these variables inside a block, so something like this. Right? And if we open the window object again, we can see how this variable is there, even though it's inside a block. So it behaves as if it was declared with var. To make a variable visible only inside a single file, we must define this file as a module. And we can do that by using an attribute inside the script tag in the HTML file that specifies its type. So in this case, module. So something like this. Right? And that is important in order to understand how the module scope works. So, as this module will restrict the access to any variable inside of it, somehow we'll need to export this variable outside of this module and import it wherever we want to use it. So, in this case, to make it simple, we're going to be using the import and export declarations that will allow us to share variables, in this case, between these two files. But I'm not going to be using the dynamic import method, as we're only talking about scope so far. So the point is to understand that the scope of a variable will be limited to this module, unless we export this variable from one module to some other module, in this case from A to B. I'll show you what I mean. Now I'll create some variables in the first module called module A, in order to share them with the other module or module B, in this case. But you can do it all the way around if you like. Just be aware of which of your files will be executed first. So if we create 3 variables, right? Now, if we want to use these variables from outside this module, so in this case from this other module, it'll give us an error. So we need to export them first and then import them from this module. So now we need to import them from the other module. So import. And by the way, we'll usually place by convention this import declaration at the top of the file and outside of any block of code, the same as we put this export declaration at the bottom of the file. And don't forget the extension. In this case, we need to add the extension as we're not using Webpack or something like that. And the thing is that in the same module, they will behave as an enclosed scope, following the rules that we've mentioned before. So no matter if they declare with var, let, or const, inside the same module, they'll behave in the same way. And now you can see the values in the console. Finally, let's talk about global scope. And we'll see the differences between module scope and global scope. I've got some other files, so it's easier to understand. Now, block scope is a more generic and unrestricted scope, and this basically means that the values of that variable can be accessed from anywhere in the code. It is equivalent to writing the variables outside of any instruction, and we can even share these variables between different files, where it is actually not a good practice, as it's easier to make mistakes if we have many variables floating around in the global scope, let's say. So it is always better to use modules. Of course, keep in mind how these files are written in the HTML file, and which one will be executed first. That's why one of the main advantages of using modules is precisely that we decide if variables will be available or not in some other files, as it is mandatory, as we've already seen, to export and input them if we want to use them from some other file. But when using a global scope, we might not be aware of their existence. Let's see what I mean. If we create some variables inside of this file, which comes before this other file, we'll be able to use them from the other file with no problem. So right. Now, if we want to use them from the other file, we can use them with no problem. So 1, 2, 3. Well, I hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. I'll see you in the next lecture. Thanks for watching.